Welcome to Modern Farm Business Podcast. This podcast is designed to help the farm leader bring their business to the next level. We'll cover everything from leadership and finance to strategy and planning. I'm your host, Dean Hefta. This week, we're starting into 3 weeks on what I'm calling Features of the Outstanding Farm. Periodically, I like to mix it up by bringing in guests with different perspectives and insights. And joining us today is John Miller, the author of QBQ, The Question Behind the Question, Flipping the Switch, Unleash the Power of Personal Accountability, Outstanding, 47 Ways to Make Your Organization Exceptional, and co-author of Raising Accountable Kids. He's founder of QBQ Incorporated, an organizational development firm based in Colorado, dedicated to helping organizations make personal accountability a core value. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you, Dean. Great introduction. Appreciate it.
Hey, yeah, we're happy to have you here and sharing your message. This podcast is all about bringing business insights to the farm leader, and I'm excited to have you not only because of the message that you have to share, but because you also know about the farmer's world too, don't you?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that today because just yesterday we picked up a new client with our QBQ training, a little firm you've probably never heard of called John Deere.
I have heard of them.
And I sent the gentleman who licensed our training program on personal accountability a couple of pictures of the John Deere balers and tractors that I used to drive in the 70s when I was only a teenager. And he was impressed, and he came back and he said, you know, the great thing about working for Deere is we've touched so many lives. And I'm sure that's exciting for John Deere employees. But that is my background. I grew up on a farm in upstate New York, and every summer we did the haying and all that. My father had horses, mostly Belgians and Clydesdales, and they eat a ton. And then I went to Cornell, where my dad was the wrestling coach, because when your father's the Cornell wrestling coach, you don't go to Harvard and play hockey, Dean, okay? That's the truth. And I got an agricultural business degree, ag business and marketing, and graduated in 1980 and joined a little company called Cargill. And I spent 5 years with Cargill as a grain trader, so we can talk grain prices if you want. So that's my background before I got into the training and speaking and authoring business.
Awesome. Well, it makes, your perspective really practical for what we're talking about. And John, your best-selling book is titled QBQ. What exactly is QBQ for our listeners, and how did you come up with the idea for it?
Well, after I left Cargill and found this position, it was up in Minneapolis, St. Paul in 1986, I found a position selling leadership and management training. And I kind of found my niche, Dean. I was pretty good at calling on executives and making phone calls and persuading them to let me come in, and then I'd set appointments with them. I'd go in and I'd sell them leadership training sessions, management skills sessions. And I sat in what I figured to be about 10,000 hours over a decade with management people in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and not in the ag world, just any industry, just human beings. And I started listening, and it took a while, but I finally caught on to the fact that we all asked some really lousy questions. Let me give you a few examples. Why do we have to go through all this change? When is someone going to train me? Why can't that department do its job right? Who made the mistake? Who dropped the ball? When are we going to find good people? And when I started hearing these questions, I thought, there's got to be a better question here that leads us to a better place. So one day I taught to a group around 1994 in St. Paul, Minnesota. I taught them to ask the question behind the question, the question behind the question. So instead of asking who dropped the ball, who made the mistake, how about asking, what can I do to contribute right now? Instead of asking, why do we have to go through all this change? What about asking, how can I adapt to the changing world? And so I taught that to a group, and it quickly became the QBQ. We all love acronyms. So the question behind the question was shortened to the QBQ. And within a year, I left the training company I was selling management training for, mid-90s, Dean, and I went off on my own and started speaking on this message of QBQ, which really brings us to a higher level of personal accountability in life. And shortly after that, my wife and I decided to move from Minneapolis. We wanted to escape the tundra, the snow in July, and we decided to move down to Denver, Colorado. We've been here 20 years, and all we do at QBQ Inc. is sell training and sell speaking and sell books, and it's all about personal accountability and that little tiny QBQ idea I came up with one day.
Well, it's amazing the power of what a good idea can have on people. And so that's a great message and a great example. And I've given out a ton of these books to people.
Well, thank you.
We have this book all over our business, and it's part of our language as well. So it's a great message.
Wow, I appreciate that.
Okay, so if I'm a farm leader building a great farm business, why is this concept so important for me to understand and to apply, John?
Well, it's interesting when you say farm leader, and I know that's your target audience. I totally understand that. But the beautiful thing, Dean, as you know, about this message of accountability and the QBQ method for achieving it, is it applies to all of us. Not to take us off message too far, but that's why my wife and I recently wrote a book called Raising Accountable Kids, because I was out speaking on personal accountability, and no matter where I went, people would say, "Oh, this is good stuff. Do you have it in a parenting format?" And so we wrote a book for parents. So when it comes to accountability, whether I'm a mom or a dad or a farm leader or a vice president of IBM, it's certainly and specific, and it applies to my life, because here's the reason. Everybody, human beings, fall into the trap of three traps, actually: victim thinking, procrastination, and blame. And those three traps, victim thinking, procrastination, and blame, would kill any business. So they would certainly kill a farm business. I mean, it all comes down to ownership. It's my business. I own it. No excuses. And so if I can stay out of those traps of victim thinking, procrastination, and blame, and move to a higher level in life, one of no excuses, it's my business, I own it, then I'm going to have a much greater chance of succeeding. But the minute I start asking lousy questions, complaining about the people I have to work with, or the employees I have, or the new generation today that doesn't want to work as hard as I want to work, or the government isn't doing enough for me. I mean, that's a big one for farmers. I'm sorry, but that's victim thinking. When we start complaining that others aren't doing enough for me, Dean, all of these human traps will kill a business, and it can be in any industry, but specifically today in a farm business, I need to say, I own it, no excuses.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, that message of no excuses is so powerful, because, man, we just lose all of our energy and motivation when we are convinced that we don't have any power. So let's say I'm really applying these concepts. What are the underlying problems that I'm really working to solve?
I am always fighting human nature. You'll find with successful people, Dean, they're just very aware of their own humanness. So, take me, for instance. We've sold a bunch of books, and I've been out speaking for 20 years, and my wife and I have 7 kids and 7 grandkids, and I teach QBQ, and I want to practice QBQ every day. However, my own humanness gets in my way. If I'm not careful, I feel sorry for myself, or I have a pity party, or I want to play victim, or maybe I feel entitled. I'm self-employed now 30 years, actually, but I can still become entitled by thinking, I've called on Dean for 3 years. Dean should buy something from me because I've called on him for 3 years. That's entitlement thinking, and we can all fall into it. So for me, and for your listeners, and maybe even for Dean, this humanness stuff, it really gets in our way, and it prevents us from succeeding. So the successful person, the achiever, is very aware of their own thoughts. So the minute I say, why don't I get more support and help? I can say, hey, wait a minute, that's victim thinking, and it takes me nowhere. The minute I say, when will others support me better? I can say, wait a minute, when I ask when questions, that's procrastination. I'm not doing anything productive and of value. The minute I ask, who made the mistake? I can say, wait a minute, that's blame. That doesn't solve any problems. So what QBQ does for your listeners and for all of us is it creates an awareness of my humanness. Oh, I'm into victim thinking. I'm into blame. I'm into procrastination. I can do better. How do I do it? A motivational speech on a podcast? No. I do it by asking the question behind the question. And we can certainly cover how that takes place, how you ask that better question.
Wow, that's powerful. I mean, questions do something to us, don't they? That change how we process information.
Well, we're taught in school, there are no dumb questions. Well, I don't know about that, but there are bad questions. And questions that take John Miller to victim thinking, procrastination, and blame are certainly lousy questions and happen to all of us. We all ask them. And that's exactly why this content, if you will, Dean, works, because we fall into these traps so easily. Because once again, as I've said about 8 times now, we're very, very human. But successful people are aware of their humanness and they overcome it.
Shifting gears a little bit, we're kicking off now on this podcast a series on building an exceptional farm. And that really makes me want to dig into your book, Outstanding 47 Ways to Make Your Organization Exceptional. What led you to write Outstanding?
I had been calling on organizations for 25 years, and I saw a pattern. And the pattern was there were good companies and there were lousy companies. Now, that's not very brilliant, but one day I thought, there are some things the better organizations do. And after 25 years, I had just collected a lot of stuff. And we started out with like 80 different ideas, and we boiled it down to 47. And people say, why did you do 47 and not 50? And I said, well, that's where I ran out of ideas, 47. Plus, it's a little catchier than 50, don't you think, Dean?
Yeah, it's unique.
But ideas like in a really great organization, decisions are made fast. The world is moving too quickly for us to be paralyzed through our own analysis. We must move quickly. Humility. Organizations that succeed, you'll find that they have a very humble spirit. They keep the mission top of mind, meaning if you're employing someone, you're helping them day in, day out know why this organization, this farm, this business exists. They don't speak in code. They call problems what they are. They say, hey, we have a problem. I have a problem. We don't call it an opportunity or an issue. We really speak plainly. I found over the years that really effective leaders speak at the 9th grade level. They don't try to fancy it up with the current buzzwords of the day. Outstanding organizations. You have people that sincerely adopt the value of forgiving mistakes. I mean, it's like road rage. Dean, you're driving along and you make a mental error and somebody gives you a gesture that says they don't like you very much. I always think, boy, there but for the grace of God go I. I mean, doesn't that other person realize that they also make mistakes? Are they really saying when they attack me with their middle finger that they never make mistakes? Well, in organizations that succeed, you have that philosophy that, hey, we all make mistakes. I need to forgive mistakes and not hold grudges against people. So that's the kind of material in the Outstanding book. It talks about coaching in the moment. We don't coach people twice a year. We do it in the moment. So a lot of good stuff. And that's where that book came from, was calling on executives over 25 years.
Makes sense. Farming right now, as you're well aware of, is in call it a lean margin mode. And one of your chapters is titled Fight the Fat. What do I need to know about fighting the fat as I build an outstanding farm?
That's funny. That evolved with, if you know who Schwan Foods is.
Sure.
Down in Marshall, Minnesota. I actually had the opportunity in 1988 to have lunch with Marvin Schwan, the founder of Schwan's, who's long gone. But we had lunch at a cafe, and over lunch, he said, sales cover sins, and lots of sales cover lots of sins. And I've never forgotten that. Organizations in good times often get fat. They maybe hire too many people. They're buying equipment they don't need. And then years later, I met this guy named Dave Ramsey, if you know who Dave Ramsey is.
You bet.
And he uses QBQ with his staff, so he's a big believer in QBQ. And so I kind of married together the Schwan's comment, sales cover sins, and lots of sales cover lots of sins, with the Dave Ramsey philosophy, and just said in that chapter, we have to be careful that we don't overspend, overindulge, and get fat during good times. We need to be always on our game. Dave Ramsey says, basically, people that know how to manage their money, they bother to bother. They bother to keep track of their money. And it goes for a business as well. So getting fat as a business can hide a lot of things we're doing wrong. So outstanding organizations are always being very careful in that area.
I like that, bother to bother. When you were talking about the book, you mentioned something that stood out to me. It said, coaching moment to moment. And when I think about coaching, the ability or, more important, the actual practice of coaching is so powerful in business today. But for a lot of people, that can seem kind of intimidating. What would you say the essentials are that I need to know to be a good moment to moment coach?
I think the answer is in the last phrase you just used, moment to moment. Dean, you probably know that in many corporations, there's this thing called the performance review.
Oh, yeah.
And lousy managers basically engage in that once a year. I mean, when I was at the big company I mentioned earlier, back in the early 80s, I basically sat down with a manager once a year to learn how I was doing. Otherwise, it was a big secret. I would love to have had more feedback, more guidance, more input on a regular basis, and more coaching. Now, nobody likes to be told they're doing something wrong. I mean, come on. Who likes that? But the only way to grow is to have someone as my rudder directing me, and I can't be directed or guided well unless I have some sort of a rudder. And that's what a coach is. Hey, you did this great today. Let me tell you why. Hey, you know what? I need to talk to you about that one behavior you're engaging in. It's not helping the team. So coaching is an in-the-moment, everyday thing. And that's when it's of value. It's of no value once a year.
Yeah, that makes sense. Pretty rare for an employee to say, I hated working there because I always knew how I was doing.
That's a good one, Dean. And it's funny. I get so tired of the debate, leadership versus management. I see it on like LinkedIn or other places on the web all the time. People say, you lead people, you manage things. Well, let me tell you this. I have never met a good people manager who is highly skilled that wasn't thought to be a leader. So conversely, when you get somebody saying, hey, my boss, Dean, is a great leader, and then you break it down, guess what you find out they are? They're really skilled people managers. They talk to people. They give them clear direction. They spend time with them. They get to know them. They confront them when they're off track. They praise them when they're on track. Really good people managers are called leaders. So we need to be skilled people managers if we want to be called leader. But I'm concerned about something. Most people, and I'm sure it happens in a farm business, have never had any people management training. So I'm going to tell you listeners right now, if you're out there and you're managing at least one person, spend some money and invest in yourself and find some really good people management training, because that's what you're doing. You're managing people and they need good management. And then maybe someday they'll call you leader.
Yeah, that's perfect. Now, help me flip this around a little bit. We talked about coaching others, but what's my role as a leader on being coachable?
Well, that's about ego. That's about ego. And in the Outstanding book, I tell a story about a client in Minnesota years ago. After we did a 3-day leadership workshop, he basically said to me, John, give me some feedback. And I was so young and naive, Dean. I was, like 33 years old, and I wasn't thinking. I gave him some honest feedback about his behavior in the 3-day session. This was the CEO. Well, guess what? He never used me again. I mean, you're a consultant. You know what I'm getting at. He said, give me feedback. I said, okay. And he never hired me for anything else again. He could not take the feedback. So obviously we all know this truth, and it's taught in the QBQ book. Humility is the cornerstone of leadership. Humility is the cornerstone of leadership. And I'm always amazed in our society today when some super athlete or a Hollywood celebrity or a politician actually says, I'm sorry, I was wrong. We all write about it. We read about it. It's all over the news. Oh my, this person showed humility. Well, why is that the exception? That should be the rule. And for leaders, it is the rule. Humility is the cornerstone of leadership. And without humility, I'm not very coachable, am I?
Absolutely. So simple advice, but not always easy advice. John, thank you so much for sharing these insights with our listeners today. If there's one thing that you want to make sure that they take away from what you've shared, what do you hope that it is?
In the QBQ book, I have found over the years, whether I'm out doing a speaking engagement, Dean, or my daughter, Kristen, who you've hired to speak to your groups, is out doing a speaking engagement on personal accountability in the QBQ, or somebody goes to our training program or just reads the book. If you really pin them down and say, what's the one thing you walked away with? It's almost always this: I can only change me. And what's amazing about that, Dean, is it's not new. There's nothing new about I can only change me. But people day in and day out, all of us, oh, if only my wife would do this. If only my son would join me in the business. If only my daughter would act more. And we forget, wait a minute, the only person I can change is me. Now, managers, doesn't mean we stop coaching. Sometimes we have to fire people too. Yep, that's right. But it's a philosophy that really works, because the day I say I can only change me, then I'm asking, what can I do to be my best today? And not worrying so much about all the people around me and what they're not doing. So that's the number one takeaway from our message is I come into a training session, I open the book, I'm frustrated with a family member or a coworker or an employee, and I realize, wait a minute, I can only change me. And then people start doing that, and life is so much better when they focus on just self.
Very powerful. Thank you. John, how can people connect with you and your concepts even more?
Thanks, Dean. QBQ.com. It's just that simple. QBQ.com. I always laugh when I was doing radio interviews 15 years ago. We'd give out phone numbers and all. No, not anymore, Dean. It's just like, come to QBQ.com if you want to see what we do and reach out to us.
Awesome. Joining us today was John Miller, author of QBQ, The Question Behind the Question, and many other great business books. John, thank you, and we'll talk again soon.
Dean, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Those were some great insights by John. I really appreciate what he was able to share with us. There was 3 things that I really took away that I wanted to highlight. The first one was the fact that the questions we ask ourselves really matter. It's very different to ask ourselves, what can I do to improve the situation? Compared to asking a question like, when will somebody do something about what's going on? One of those questions lead us to action and give us energy to do something. The other leads us to procrastination and victim thinking. The second thing that stood out to me was the fact that great leaders coach moment by moment. They take the time and have the attention to recognize developing the employees and helping them to achieve higher performance means I need, in a minute-by-minute basis, on a day-by-day basis, week by week, to give feedback to help people with their performance so they can continually know how they're doing. It isn't about an annual review to let them know how they're doing. It is the relationship that we have where I am a coach to help be their rudder on their journey. And finally, the power of recognizing I can only change me. I'm the only person that has control over my decisions, my emotions, my reactions, my actions. I don't have that power over others, so I have to begin with me. The fact is, I can only change me. Thanks for joining me this week. It's been a great session. As always, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell a friend about what we're doing here at Modern Farm Business Podcasts. And if you have any ideas, thoughts, or feedback, be sure to send me an email, dean@modernfarmbusiness.com. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.